is hate, let me bring love. Where there is offense, let me bring pardon. Where there is discord, let me bring you. Where there is error, let me bring truth. Where there is doubt, let me bring faith. Where there is darkness, let me bring light. Where there is sadness, let me bring joy. Because it is in getting oneself that one is found. And for me, the work of standing is the forgetting of oneself in service has become the largest project entities ever been on collective. We have our own stuff gets in the way as we're trying to figure out how to. And so I thought that it would be appropriate to compose a little tune about experience interval. So this is my experience interval tune. So today I want to share with you some work that I've been doing about maybe a year. I'm fortunate to be in a doctoral study research and better understanding of people and the way that they do it. My dissertation that I chose was how do developmentally mature change agents design sustainable change agents, but not just your average run-of-the-mill change agent, but one that actually has developed for some reason or another into a depth of consciousness that gives them a different kind of engage with the world. And so they engage the world. And does that look different than the way an average change agent might look at sustainability and my initiative? And so I set out to try and figure it out. And so 30, 35 change agents that were senior people in NGOs or business or leading consultancies, working in the government, and interviewed them, and also asked them to take a psychology assessment that literally around how they make meaning. So the idea here is that as we develop, our meaning-making systems become more complex. We go from just thinking that things are black and white to recognizing that they're regional. You can think of the development of meaning-making systems as the development from a traditional way of seeing the world, maybe the way that your grandmother saw it, to more of a modern worldview that's rolling around with the iPod and out there using business to rock the world, to maybe more of a cultural creative perspective where a postmodern is more in tune with the sensitivities. So that's one way of looking at kind of the meaning-making systems. And there's actually pretty rigorous developmental psychology assessments that can begin to articulate the meaning-making path. So I also test developmental psychology as well. And then I honed in on the folks who scored at the highest stages of this scale in meaning-making and really looked much more closely at the way they design sustainability tools. And so what I've brought for you today is from that. And it consists of compilations of one of the questions that I asked them, which was, if you could give 3 pieces of advice to tomorrow's sustainability leaders, what would you say? And so what I'd like to invite us to do is actually go through these. I'm not going to go the whole thing, it's 12 pages or something like that. One of that you can take home if you're interested, and you can read a little bit more. But it's first for me, it's fascinating, and I think there's probably sense in it. And so, hand this out, and we'll go from there. So we'll start one on this end. You finished this yesterday.
Yeah, I put this together yesterday morning.
Cutting edge.
Wow. So this is technically the developmental stage or the developmental spectrum there on the front. I'm not going to get into it. It doesn't matter if you're not familiar with it. This is built towards topics. But the point that I want to make here is that the folks that it has these kind of business-friendly names for these different psychological stages of making, and it goes from kind of the least complex bottom to the most complex on the top. I'm on the front page here. This far column on the right. So it goes from impulsive on the bottom to the ironist at the top. And so what I did was I interviewed a bunch of people, and people were assessed kind of from achiever up to ironist. These would be those that were assessed as strategists, alchemists, and ironists. Okay, so there's some samples here that we can look at. So, turning the page here. So then my question there at the top is if you could share 3 pieces of advice to farm sustainability leaders about how to design effective sustainability initiatives, what would you say? And so the way I've structured this document is that I started with what those who have the most complex way of seeing the world as was assessed by this assessment, which is just an assessment, right? An actual depiction of all of who they are, of course. But it gives some good insight. Basically, I've structured this paper in a way that those who have the most complex meaning-making system are at the top in the beginning of the paper, and those who have an earlier meaning-making system are toward the end. So pay attention as we move through this to kind of how things change as we get into the and I thought I'd just start with kind of folks that are really kind of outliers in consciousness. And you got to understand that folks who kind of scored a unit of action logic, which is this first one, or the ironist, represent maybe 1/10 of the percent of the Western population, maybe 0.2% of the Western population, and global population way less than 10%. So what's interesting about this is that a number of the folks who were assessed at the highest and most complex meaning-making stages are actually pretty young. And I found that a number of the folks that were assessed kind of some of the earlier ones were people that I would think would have had decades of kind of experience to drive their development. But there's something happening in collective consciousness today. There's something happening in the development of humanity where folks are showing up, being born, and kind of rocketing up these developmental spots. And that's fascinating to me. And I think it bodes a lot for the future of humanity that it's just like consciousness is kind of turbocharging little babies as they come in and saying, you know, like, you're going to need more than I gave your parents. You know, sorry about that, parents. But, and so it's interesting. And then of course, what this all says to me is that one of the greatest practices that we can do as sustainability practitioners is to take the reins of our own consciousness. We won't get into that today, but if you develop your own integral transformative practice, you can really loosen up the developmental structures inside of you such that your paradigms are shifting over time on a regular basis, and you don't get arrested at kind of new ways, at old ways of seeing the world. And one of the keys to doing that, by the way, is attending events like this, where you're surrounded by people that challenge you and inspire you into a new way of seeing the world and will hold you at a more complex way of meaning. So let's move into this a little bit. So this first one is
these are all pseudonyms in here, so I called her Luz. And she's Canadian-based and runs a consultancy and speaks at university. And so what I've done here is I've highlighted kind of the three main points that they've made. And so her first piece of advice here is practice on whatever you do. And she makes the point that everything that we do matters. Everything that we do actually is an intervention in the moment in sustainability. And so to treat your work as a sacred practice, she points out that the integral community or consciousness development community has often really thrown itself into developing practices in developing self, but then kind of forget to take that capacity and do something with it in the world. And then she points out that the sustainability folks tend to get really, really good about figuring out what needs to be done in the world, but then forget about their practice and completely burn out. And I think that this is important to marry our personal practice of development with the work that we're doing in the world. She also points out, jumping down to this third one here, she points out that really, if we aren't going to step forward and take responsibility for what's happening, those of us whose hearts are breaking wide open because of the poverty and the suffering and the pain that's happening across the planet, those of us who do feel traumatized by things that are happening on the other side of the planet, those of us who are seeing broad visions for the way that society can develop and evolve, and they're pulling down all sorts of insights around that. If folks like us are not willing to step up and take leadership and serve the development of humanity, then somebody else will, who will essentially maybe not do it from as deep a place of heart or as deep or as wide a wisdom as we might be able to. So for me, it was really an invitation from her to acknowledge the blessing and the gift and the responsibility that comes with a deeper perspective and a more open heart. I want to shift here to page 4. So this is dropping down a little bit to an alchemist action logic, which is a little bit earlier action logic, but still very, very sophisticated and complex. And I describe it there if you want to get into it later on. But what I want you to notice is that, so with that person who we just went over, who has unity consciousness, and this was the theme that came up in the other person I had there as well, it's all about the interior space out of which we're operating as sustainability practitioners. And you'll see that theme still in this kind of action logic as well, that as sustainability practitioners, there's lots of external stuff to pay attention to, but the real leverage point is looking inside, getting your shadow stuff out of the way, recognizing the constructs and the paradigms that are established out here, and essentially bringing more consciousness to our awareness and our action around that.